This is why the 25th Amendment was written. It was ratified in 1967, authorizing the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to remove the president from power when and if that president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The 25th Amendment was written for the day when the Democratic leader of the United States Senate could credibly say, quote, "The president is ranting like an unhinged madman," as he said yesterday. It was impossible to imagine back when they wrote the 25th Amendment. It was impossible for them.
A sitting Republican, someone who voted for this man 3 times, standing up and calling him insane, not misguided, not off message, insane, that word from his own side. And the Republican Party's response is silence. Complete silence, nothing. And Lawrence O'Donnell was not wrong about a single thing he just said.
A day with the President of the United States ranting like an unhinged madman until Donald Trump took the oath of office. The 25th Amendment was written for the day when a former Republican member of Congress who voted for that Republican president 3 times would declare to the world, he has gone insane. The 25th Amendment was written for yesterday.
The 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967. It exists for one specific purpose: for the moment when the person holding the most powerful office on earth is no longer able to actually do that job. The Senate's Democratic leader calling the President of the United States an unhinged madman on record in public. And not a single Republican has been willing to agree out loud. You know what stands out here? The people who expressed the most concern about Biden's age, who made an entire political argument out of cognitive decline, who ran ad after ad of Biden stumbling over a word, those same people are completely quiet right now, because their candidate is the one who has not been seen publicly for 3 days straight. And I want to talk about that absence, because this is not just a slow news weekend. This is not Trump taking a personal day. The man does not take breaks. He is physically incapable of staying off camera. He stops Marine One for reporters in the rain. He calls into cable news shows at midnight. He held a press conference in a McDonald's. This is a man who has spent his entire adult life seeking cameras, and suddenly he vanished. 3 days, no public appearance. And what was he doing instead? Posting 50 times on Truth Social, going after Iran, going after Apple.
He then, after our conversation, reiterated this claim. I'll read you his Truth Social post quickly. But he said Iran is having a very hard time figuring out who their leader is. They just don't know. The infighting is between the hardliners, who have been losing badly on the battlefield, and the moderates, who are not very moderate at all. Then he continues, no ship can enter or leave without the approval of the United States Navy. That's in reference to the blockade. It is sealed up tight until such time as Iran is able to make a deal. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Now, our colleague, David Rode, I should point out, did a quick fact check of my conversation with the president and in conversations he had with his sources.
50 posts and 0 public appearances, because his own staff was apparently concerned about what the public would see if he walked out that door. And this is the article that broke it open. Read this carefully, because every word matters here. Trump 79 stays out of public view for 3 days amid fears of instability. President Donald Trump 79 is set to emerge in public for the first time in 3 days amid concerns that he is struggling behind closed doors. The last time the president was seen in public was Saturday morning, April 18th at the White House, where he signed an executive order directing regulators to speed up the review of psychedelic treatments. Later that day, he visited his golf club in Virginia, but the typically camera-seeking president stayed entirely behind closed doors for the rest of the weekend and on Monday. Instead, he reached out to reporters with phone calls and posted or reposted repeatedly, more than 50 times since Saturday morning on his Truth Social platform. It comes as critics have raised concerns about Trump's increasingly erratic behavior, from his threatening posts to apparent confusion over Iran talks. Since the president's last appearance on Saturday morning, he has posted a series of angry social media statements taking aim at Iran, Democrats, NATO allies, Apple, promoting election theories, and more. The typically camera-seeking president. That is how they described him. Typically camera-seeking. And he vanished. That tells you something significant about what was happening behind those doors. His own people were apparently concerned about letting him appear publicly. And then comes the Newsweek report. Larry Johnson, a retired CIA analyst, claimed Trump tried to access nuclear codes, but was stopped by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That is the claim.
Hi, Vedika. You're going to be talking to us about some allegations that have surfaced online, alleging that Donald Trump has been blocked from using nuclear codes against Iran. Talk us through what is circulating.
Well, Sharon, former CIA analyst Larry Johnson alleged on a podcast this week that Donald Trump wanted to use the nuclear codes against Iran, but that he was blocked from doing so by General Dan Kane, the chairman of his Joint Chiefs of Staff. So let's take a listen now directly to those claims that we heard in this podcast this week.
They had an emergency meeting Saturday night. And apparently, well, one report coming out of that meeting at the White House is that Trump wanted to use the nuclear codes, and General Dan Kane stood up and said no.
Short, significant, and serious. A retired CIA analyst going on record saying the President of the United States tried to access the nuclear codes and was physically stopped by his own general. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff looked at Donald Trump and made a judgment call, and that judgment call was that this man could not be trusted with this at that moment. Now, I want to be fair here. This is one source, one claim from one analyst. It has not been independently confirmed by every outlet. So I am not going to present it as established fact. But here is the thing. It fits. It fits into everything else we are seeing. The absence from public view, the erratic posting, the confusion over where J.D. Vance even was, the phone calls to reporters where he could not keep his own story straight, the confusion over Iran talks. All of it points in the same direction. And the direction it points raises serious questions. Because think about what it means if the generals are the ones drawing the line. Think about what it means that the safeguard is not the cabinet. It is not the vice president invoking the 25th Amendment. It is not Congress doing its job. It is the military. Informally, quietly, behind closed doors, just saying no and hoping he does not push back harder. That is not a formal system. That is not governance. That is people improvising around a man who perhaps should not be in that building. And the confusion is not just about the nuclear codes. Trump was on the phone with reporters over the weekend, and he did not know where J.D. Vance was, his own vice president. He said Vance was in the air, and then Vance showed up at the White House, and Caroline Leavitt, his press secretary, had to keep correcting him on phone calls with reporters. The press secretary correcting the president in real time because he cannot keep his own facts together long enough to finish a sentence. This is a man who is supposed to be running foreign policy negotiations with Iran, who is supposed to be managing a trade dispute with China, who is supposed to be coordinating military operations across multiple theaters, and he does not know where his vice president is. There is a version of this story where you might feel some sympathy. A 79-year-old man who perhaps should not be doing this job anymore, surrounded by people who are using him as a figurehead while they do what they want behind the scenes. There is a version of this that is almost difficult to watch, but then you remember that this man chose this. He ran for this office again. He pushed his way back into the White House, and now the people around him are managing him carefully, reading him his executive orders as he sits there nodding because he may have no idea what is in them, keeping him away from cameras because they do not know what he will say, and apparently informing his generals to make sure he does not make a catastrophic decision on a Tuesday afternoon because something on Truth Social made him upset. That is not a president functioning normally. That is a situation of concern. And the people who are most responsible for this are not Trump alone. Trump has always been Trump. He was always going to be this way. The people most responsible are the ones in his own party who watched this happen, who saw the signs, who heard the reports, who knew what was going on behind closed doors, and said nothing, did nothing, voted for more tax cuts, and smiled for the camera. The Republicans in Congress who had multiple opportunities to address this and chose political advantage over country every single time. The cabinet members who could invoke the 25th Amendment right now and are choosing not to. The generals who are apparently saying no to nuclear access privately but have not gone on record publicly because they still want their careers intact. All of them bear responsibility. Every single one. Now, the man who received 5 military deferments during Vietnam just told us he would have won that war quickly. Vietnam, the war that lasted 19 years, the war that killed over 58,000 American soldiers, the war that had profound and lasting consequences for this country. That war, he would have won it in a week. He took Venezuela over in 45 minutes, a sovereign nation with its own military. He took it over in 45 minutes. And then he says, actually, it was a day. Let us be conservative. No, wait, it was 45 minutes. He cannot even keep his own account consistent. But here is what nobody is saying out loud, and I am going to say it. When Donald Trump says he would have won Vietnam in a week, when he says he took Venezuela in 45 minutes, when he compares himself to World War II and Korean War timelines and says he would have done it faster, he is not talking about conventional military strategy. He is not talking about troop deployments and supply chains and diplomatic channels. Think carefully about what kind of action could end a 19-year war in a week. There is only one kind of weapon that could take over a country in 45 minutes. This is not me reading into things. This is a man who has already threatened to eliminate the entirety of Iranian civilization. Those were his words. The entirety of Iranian civilization. That is not a tariff threat. That is not a conventional negotiating tactic. That is language that points in a very concerning direction. And he used it out loud on the record. And the people around him called it a negotiating tactic. And everyone seemed to accept that as normal. It is not a negotiating tactic if it does not work. That is the part that keeps getting missed. A negotiating tactic is something that moves the other side. Iran is not responding differently. Iran is still doing whatever Iran was doing before Trump made his civilizational threat. So it was not a tactic. It was an outburst, a very dangerous outburst from a man who apparently tried to access nuclear codes and had to be physically stopped by a general. Connect those dots. And the military deferment issue is worth addressing because this man received 5 deferments during Vietnam. His feet were said to hurt. He could not go. Meanwhile, 58,000 Americans who did not have fathers who could call in favors went over there and did not come back. And now he is sitting in the Oval Office telling a television anchor that he would have won that war quickly. He would have handled it. The man who spent the Vietnam era in Manhattan building a real estate empire. The lack of self-awareness in that statement is genuinely difficult to put into words, but you know what is even harder to process? Nobody in that interview pushed back. Nobody said, Mr. President, you received 5 deferments. What exactly would you have done differently? Nobody, because that is the media environment we are operating in right now. Soft questions, nodding heads, and Trump just fills the silence with whatever narrative is currently running through his mind. And this Vietnam comparison was not random. He was not just reminiscing. He pulled out a chart. He said, I just looked at a little chart. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq. And then himself, he literally put himself on a chart next to the largest military conflicts in modern history. He is measuring himself against World War II and saying he is doing better. 5 months, he is doing well. The trade disputes, the Iran situation, whatever is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, 5 months and he is already comparing himself favorably to the Allied forces defeating Nazi Germany. That chart, that little chart he pulled out, that is not the behavior of a man who is mentally stable. That is not the behavior of someone who is thinking clearly. That is the behavior of someone who has lost perspective on reality and is now constructing an alternate version of history where he is the greatest military mind who ever lived, despite never serving a single day in uniform. And while he is focused on his chart, what is actually happening in the world? The Strait of Hormuz situation is not resolved. 30% of the world's fertilizer moves through that region, 20% of its energy. If that strait closes and we are closer to that possibility than most people want to acknowledge, you are not looking at an inconvenience. You are not looking at higher gas prices for a few months. You are looking at a global economic crisis. You are looking at food insecurity in parts of the world that are already on the edge. You are looking at the kind of cascading economic collapse that takes decades to recover from. And the man who is supposed to be managing that situation just told a television anchor he would have won Vietnam quickly. This is not a political disagreement. This is not left versus right. This is not even a question of policy preferences. This is a question of basic cognitive function, basic grip on reality, basic understanding of where he is, what his job requires of him. And the 25th Amendment, I keep coming back to it because that is where this all leads. It was designed for this, not for a president who makes poor decisions, not for a president with low approval ratings, not for a president who loses a war war or struggles economically. It was designed for the specific moment when a president is genuinely unable to discharge the duties of the office. Unable. Not unwilling, unable. And we have a Senate Democratic leader saying it publicly. We have a former Republican congressman who voted for Trump 3 times saying it publicly. We have generals apparently acting on it privately. We have a staff that is keeping him from public appearances because they are concerned about what will happen if he speaks freely. At what point does the cabinet look at each other and say we have to do something? At what point does J.D. Vance, and I am not a J.D. Vance supporter by any means, but at what point does even J.D. Vance look at this situation and think this is going to end badly for everyone, and he is the one constitutionally positioned to address it? The answer to that question, unfortunately, is probably never, because the people around Trump are not there to govern. They are there to benefit. They are there for access and power and proximity to influence, and they are not going to step away from that as long as they are still getting what they came for. The 25th Amendment requires the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. That is a coordinated act of political courage from a group of people who have demonstrated very little political courage at any point in this administration. So where does that leave us? It leaves us here, with generals quietly saying no, with staff keeping the president from public appearances, with a retired CIA analyst going on record about nuclear codes, with a 79-year-old man posting 50 times on Truth Social while his team tries to figure out how to get through another week. And it leaves us with 2 moments from one morning that tell you something significant about the state of this presidency. A legal scholar explaining why the 25th Amendment was written, and the president himself casually telling America he would have resolved the Vietnam War quickly if he had been around. This is where we are. This is the reality. And the people who have the power to change it are choosing every single day not to. Because their interests are being served and their donors are satisfied. And as long as the situation continues, they do not appear concerned about who is nominally leading the country, but the generals apparently do. And that is both the most concerning and the most reassuring thing I have said in this entire video at the same time. Concerning because it means the formal system has apparently failed to the point where we are relying on informal military resistance to prevent a serious incident. Reassuring because at least someone is saying no. Someone has to. If you got something out of this, subscribe because it genuinely helps. Either way, glad you stayed to the end. I will see you in the next one.